Good morning. I'm Diego Calaon. I'm an archaeologist and I work with the archaeology of Venice since the late 90s of last centuries.
I'm Jane Damosto. I'm the co-founder and director of an NGO based in Venice called We Are Here Venice. And our aim is to change the future for the city and the lagoon.
It is a very pleasure to me to meet Jane, and I know from many years her work in the lagoon, and I would like to know better how her formation of environmental scientist is working on determining what to do with the lagoon, how to preserve this ecosystem.
That question provokes quite a long answer. I was actually born in South Africa, so I've always been fascinated with nature and actually seen myself as part of nature. Not being born in a city makes it very much easier for people to see themselves as living within the ecology and not something separate from it. I went on to read zoology at Oxford, and then I did my postgraduate work at Imperial College London at the Centre for Environmental Technology. And then by a strange twist of fate, via working in Milan, I ended up living in Venice for purely traditional reasons, because my husband is Venetian, and if you're married, you move, you end up living with the person you marry. And I've loved being here ever since, in all these 25 years. And it's because Venice represents something. It's like humanity's answer to sustainability, because it has this millennial existence. It's one of the longest surviving civilizations in the world today. But on the other hand, we really feel like we're the canary in the mine, because we're, at the forefront of all the biggest challenges that are coming from things like climate change and pollution, not to mention sea level rise.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, are all...
How did you become an archaeologist?
Oh, that is a nice question. I start my university without the willing to be an archaeologist. I start to study history of art. But while I was doing university, I had a chance to participate in one of these training camp for students in the Venetian Lagoon. And there I understood that the way to understand how the past works for me was to touch the materiality of the past, the object of the past, uncover the past from the earth. And so I start my training in archaeology, and the training in archaeology in Italy was quite traditional. So understanding styles, patterns, understanding how the relationship between historical sources and elements of the landscape work in the past. But when I start to try to focus more and more on Venice, I found that for studying Venice through the archaeology, you need a little bit more. You need to go beyond the stone. The view, the beauty view of the city, and also the artifacts are not enough to understand how Venice worked in the past. And so it's for that that I had the chance to be trained also in Stanford with specific program of anthropology that helped me to consider the lagoon of Venice and its archaeology and history in a much more global way, where the natural elements and the human elements are interconnected, entangled together. And so it is possible to trace the history of Venice not following the name of the dukes or the name of the popes or the battles that has been so well documented in our history books, but for example using wood, water, using the relationship with people and wood and water, how labor for transforming wood and water form what is Venice, what was Venice in the past.
So let's look at our slide number 1.
Yeah.
I'd say this it shows kind of unites Diego's viewpoint and my viewpoint, you know, by taking an image, a satellite image of Venice from far away, and it's, one can't distinguish between the elements that make up Venice on a, you know, on a very direct way, but you can see the main elements that characterize Venice, which is, you know, at the intersection between the sea, the mainland, and the rivers. And ultimately, I think what's interesting about our two viewpoints is the role of humans in moderating these interrelationships. And I think it's important for people to keep in mind how Venice has no, you know, reference state. Venice isn't, you know, like a single church or like a piece of tropical rainforest that has a minimum list of species that need to be represented for it to still be called rainforest. The Venice is represented by the dynamics of the different elements that are composed the lagoon system, and as well as the historic city on the island. The lagoon is a series of relationships between the water that comes and goes with the tides, the sediments that came with the rivers, but since the rivers were diverted 500 years ago, the issue for the lagoon is retaining the current, you know, the right amount of sediment for the system to still be characterized like a lagoon and not represent the other extreme of where a lagoon can evolve, which is to ultimately become like an open bay of the sea. And everywhere else in the world, lagoons have either evolved in one direction, you know, with more and more sediments, they've gradually silted up, the wetlands have expanded, the wetlands have consolidated, and the lagoons have become an extension of the mainland. And to use an ancient example, Ravenna, not very far from here, used to be part of a lagoon, didn't it? And now,
yeah, absolutely.
I don't know how long it takes to get from Ravenna to the beach, but it's a significant distance. Whereas Venice is still the way it is because of human interventions. And it's exciting for me to be talking to you as an archaeologist, where your time frame starts 2000 years BC, and my time frame as an environmental scientist studying the lagoon starts 500 years ago, when the main infrastructural intervention consisted in the diversion of the rivers that were silting up Venice so much that its future as a maritime power was jeopardized, because the then what were called big ships then were having difficulty coming across the lagoon to San Marco. So
I like very much the fact that you are referring to this dynamism in between environment and human, and this dynamism is twofold. So it works because there is this strict relationship in between the relationship, the environment, and the living people there. So if we look, for example, this relationship, looking at the first Venice, if we ask ourselves how looks like the first Venice. Venice was over a lagoon when it started. The answer is quite complicated, but if we look at the second slide, that is a sequence, a stratigraphic sequence that we can find in the Venetian lagoon. This is from Torcello. You see how our ancestor lived in Venice. These black layers are the living layers of many early medieval houses dated between the 6th and the 8th century in Torcello Island. What you are seeing there, you are seeing a sequence of reclaiming land, clay, the yellow one, and the floor, what remains of the wooden floors of houses that were placed just in front of the river in the Torcello Island. In fact, if now we have the lagoon, for the first centuries of history of Venice, we have to image or look for rivers and the relationship being between the rivers and the trade route of that rivers towards the mainland. All the emplacement, the settlement were exactly at the mouth of the river for connecting this place, and were very dynamic dynamic sites. The water level of the river were rising up quite fast, but everything was changing quite a lot. And this kind of settlement, these kind of houses that were reinventing themselves each generation, rising up a new level, so facing a new level of water, and redefining the house also in the shape, in the way that was oriented towards the river side, is exactly the answer that those people had to the environment. So they were adapting themselves to this kind of environment, building wood houses. I use the word houses, not huts. They were very nice houses. The material culture that we found in that levels of mud is exceptional, is the same that we have in Rome, but we don't have the palaces.
Remind me, when are we in time?
We have
talking about.
We are between the 6th and the 8th century AD. So we are just 200 years before the rising up, the building up of the first St. Mark Church, for example. So we are at the end of the Roman times and just before the starting of Venice itself. So what I think
it's interesting to mention that. Where did they get the wood from?
Oh, that is a very interesting question. Up to a few years ago, we were thinking that the wood was almost from the mainland, and the wood traveled also from the mountains towards the rivers. But very recent research on Torcello Island excavations, so studying the charcoals and the wooden remains that we have, we understood that the first wood is local. So the first lagoon environment is not only water, but is a landscape rich of forest, local forest. Everything that had a little bit of land is quite grown, so there is quite a lot of trees, and we understand that probably the sites that were able to produce a huge quantity of infrastructure, because wood was used not only for houses but also for piers, for waterfronts, for everything that you need to live in a watery landscape like that, were the one that they had a huge quantity of forest nearby. And probably the fact that they deforest quite a lot this tiny islet or this tiny lagoon scape threatened the islands itself, threatened the landscape itself, because without the forest, some specific areas start to be much more affected by erosion also at that time. So the problem of erosion is not only a modern problem, was a problem of also of the people of the ancestor of Venice. So they had to cope with that. And we have the first laws, rules, that they ask to people to do not cut the trees that are in the lagoon and to use the wood that comes from outside. So from a given point, use only mainland wood.
Are you able to tell which species of trees they were?
Yeah, it is a very local species, and so, but they are very keen to use some species for building construction and other for firing. They were producing ceramics and wood and and glass, so they need a lot of charcoal also for that. For all these, they were using small trees, but also we found fruit trees or elements that comes really from the small bushes. For houses, almost were oaks, local oaks.
Oaks.
Yeah.
We don't see many oaks these days.
No, at all, at all. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. It is also very interesting for that we can also understand what were the environment. It is funny. There is a funny things that we still present in Torcello, but also in Venice and so on. That among the trees, the cultivated trees, so the imported trees, peaches were the one that they have the most. And not only for the fruit, but also because it is a quite good fuel when it is transforming charcoal.
Because I don't know, under 21st century conditions, peach trees are actually really difficult to cultivate in the lagoon. Apricots do better. The peaches get diseases very quickly. And I think something that's important to note is how from these early days, there was an idea of territorial management that went far, far, far beyond the boundary of the lagoon and right through through to the end of the Venetian Republic. One of the most important aspects of the history of those times is, how carefully they managed the wider area of Venice, whereas now our challenges are, based on the friction that there is between the islands of the lagoon and the rest of the same municipality that's on the mainland, or the interests of the port that's still part of the islands of Venice. And this kind of broad viewpoint seems to have been completely lost.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, also before you mention about the how the Renaissance Venice was jeopardized in its port city conception by the lagoon transformation. And for example, at that time, using this broad vision, they decide really to intervene at large scale. It is interesting to compare what was the relationship in between the scale of the intervention and the problem and the issues, environmental issues, in between modern time and contemporary time and antiquity. I mean, late Roman and early medieval. It is true that there was something different. So if we look, for example, the location of the settlement around Venice before Venice, we have a Roman city, Altinum, that now is a completely in the mainland, completely not a watery landscape, but we know from the sources, also from the archaeology, that was a city very much like to the actual Venice, with channels, with bridges, with a port inside the city itself. What did happen? That the lagoon moved because the river silted the old lagoon, and they transformed the coastline. So the coastline was moved towards east. What was the answer? Was to rebuild and reshape the harbor up to the point that was not too much expensive to do. And in the third, fifth, sixth century, they start to move the harbor infrastructure in a new area towards east, towards the seaside, where it was much more easier to have a new harbor infrastructure. And moving the harbor infrastructure, they move the people, they move the labor that they were employed in making the harbor, but also in maintaining it. And at that time, the labor were all slaves.
Slaves from where?
Were local slaves in Roman time. Local, I mean, in North Italy, or when we had all the words over the Alps, they come from area from like today Austria-Hungary, or that part of Europe. But the problem of the slave is another key point that make a relationship in between landscape and labor, because you know that Venice use a lot of workforce locally to reclaim land, to build this kind of structure and so on. The early Venetian, I mean, but they are also quite well known for being involved in slave trade, because one of the things that they did was to have trade with the Arabs, mostly on Alexandria, and trade with them. And one of the goods that they earn a lot of money were slaves. Slaves that they were coming from the same area, North Europe, but in that time, we are in the 9th century, these slaves, they were the product of the so-called barbarian wars. And the Venetian, they moved that slaves towards the south because they were a very rich product to be traded. The interesting thing is that we start to understand that there are a sort of social distinction in between which slave you sell, people that come from abroad, which labor, forced labor, slave, is very hard to define the social definition. You use for local work, probably locals. And so this need to have different people, different races for doing different works. And also this is quite an interesting element that is normally not told about the origin of this city.
I think we need a whole nother conversation for this.
Yeah, for that.
There's a lot of parallels also between what you're saying about, archaeological times and what we're seeing now in Venice with the kind of issues in the local economy and mass tourism, and the way that there's people are reduced to having to work in the kind of current socio-economic framework. But this is taking us a little outside the remit.
Absolutely.
I better quickly ask for slide number 2 before we get too far off.
Yeah. Oh, this nice lagoon, man-made or natural made.
This is a pair of images that I chose that shows a map of the lagoon drawn in 1763 by Angelo Emo, and a recent photograph looking from the northern lagoon towards the Fondamente Nuove. And I really chose this to remind ourselves about the, intimate and inextricable connection there is between the city, which you can see in the map on the left. You can just about discern that kind of fish-shaped set of islands, which formed, after the archaeological period that Diego is concerned with. And you see the city now. But if you don't think of these two elements as part of a single system, I don't think we can have the Venice that we all think of when we say Venice, and the Venice that a lot of people still live in. And the important thing is to recognize, as I said before, not just the role of humans in regulating the Venice Lagoon environment, but their dependence on what we now call ecosystem services of the lagoon. And the lagoon contains those wonderful salt marshes, are important for the biodiversity. They have important functions in treating, maintaining water quality. They contain the fish that we eat and that the fishermen catch for the sake of their livelihoods. They provide the transport infrastructure, because we move around in boats, but it also represents a highly dynamic system. So you can't draw a map of the lagoon right now as we speak. They're still deliberating this so-called piano morfologico, the morphological plan for the lagoon, which is the equivalent of the urban land use plan for the historic city of Venice, and indeed any other city in the world is nowadays governed by some kind of land use delineation, whatever you want to call it. And the morphological plan has associated with it, the limits of what's possible, how wide, how deep the channels are, how much salt marsh needs to be maintained. I think people need to know that compared to when the Angelo Amor map was drawn, and now the lagoon has lost almost 5/6 of the salt marsh. And the salt marsh are like the vital organs of the lagoon. And we're in this critical state where the future for Venice depends on the decisions that are made now, and which elements of these we fight for and we keep as part of our lagoon system in order to have a future for Venice as a living city. And I know that you, Diego, have done interesting thinking, transferring what you know from archaeological times to our view of Venice today and how we deal with these critical things like flooding.
Yeah. No, in fact, it is very connected what you are saying, because in fact, it is interesting to ask ourselves what means water, for example, the lagoon, the water of the lagoon for us and for the people in the past. For example, was Emo the geographer who drew the map that you showed before? How he conceptualize water? Was only an empty space in between two islands, or was exactly what you were referring, a space live, full of things, full of salt marshes, full of fish, full of opportunities? And probably I think it's much more like that, no? That they were very aware in the 16th, 17th centuries that waters, the watery part of the scape was not empty space, but they were fundaments of this dynamic system.
Also, the way that they lived in the city was highly interconnected. It wasn't just Venice and the rest of the lagoon. They were connected to all the other islands of the lagoon, some of which we don't have anymore because they've been eroded away.
Yeah, absolutely. So in fact, is this that we have to look for. So which is now and which was the relationship with water? We choose a very funny picture in the next slide to speak about it. It seems that the Tetrarch here, they are frightened by the rising water in St. Mark's Square. This water that goes up and up and seems to swallow and cover everything. But so in somehow we are frightened by very high water, and of course we have to. But in the past, people were frightened or not? Probably were less frightened about the impact of high tides. First of all,
because it happened a lot less frequently.
Yes, this is the first question. And why happen less frequently? Because the city changed through time much more quicker than today. The living part of the city, so where people lived, were places that they were rebuilt every single generation or couple of generation, re-updating the walking level of the ground floor, updating with the rising level of the sea. At that time, sea that was rising up at less with a rhythm that is not comparable with today, but still they were updating the city. But moreover, the idea that something should be fixed through time for a long time was not there. If you look at the recent high tide, the one of last November, it impacted very heavily San Marco Square, all this historic center. But there is one place in the city, in the historic city, that was not impacted. Santa Lucia railway station. Santa Lucia railway station, so the today railway station, because it is very high. Why is high? Because over there is modern infrastructure built at the end of 19th century, early 20th century, and the level chosen was a level that was referring to the high tide of that time, not the high tide of the medieval Venice. So there were no issues of conservation, preservation. They destroyed hectares of the cities and also churches, and they really transformed, huge transformation of an area. They re-actualized the city in a modern way, and in fact, somehow that area still works. What is happening? That
but we wouldn't want the whole of Venice to look like Santa Lucia train station.
It would be awful, even if the station is nice in its architecture. It will be awful. These are the two extremes. No, from one side we have Venice left as it was with no intervention. And so after the end of Serenissima, up to the very recent year, where we restarted to dig up the channels and to have strong restoration works in the city for redefining walking levels, for example, Insula, this project that the municipality had for raising up of some very fundamental centimeters the walking level of the Calli, the street of Venice.
They were doing that work around the time when I first came to Venice, and I witnessed a very vicious debate between the engineers of Insula, who wanted to build the whole of Venice up to 1 meter 20, 1.5 meters, relative to the reference 0, which is a separate thing that will come in my recommended reading for everybody to understand these figures that we're using. And then there were the distinguished architects of UAV, Architecture University of Venice, that were saying you can't change the architectonic qualities of the city so much. You know, palaces shouldn't lose the steps leading up to the doorway. Or when you look at all the wells now that are in the middle, well, we can't even call them wells, we're supposed to call them cisterns because they were rainwater collection systems, but anybody looking at them would think they're wells. Anyway, most of them no longer have the steps at the base because ground level has been made so high.
Yeah, this is the very center of the question that I was trying to say, because the idea of preserving the authenticity of the historical center that in the meantime became a UNESCO UNESCO site, this idea that we have to preserve this authenticity of spatial relationship, even also on not moving a stone because it's part of its unicity, in somehow freezed the opportunity for many years, in my opinion, too many, the opportunities to let the Venetian to follow different solution of coping with that. One of the solution was this rising up. Other solution could be this tank building on the bottom part of the palaces or whatever. I have not the solution, but what I was saying, that we stop the relationship with the environmental change in the sake of preserving Venice, preserving the facade.
To maintain the kind of system dynamics way of seeing things, you know, we described at the beginning, it's a question of islands, sediments, rivers, and the sea. Now we're talking about, from flooding, we've moved to talking about kind of living Venice, and we're getting close to, you know, issues relating to the future of Venice, which is something that, you know, we are here. Venice is its mission is to think of that, and you, as a Venetian researcher, your life also depends on the future of Venice. So the same system dynamics, we need to apply it to the stakeholders of Venice. You know, who's going to make these decisions? Do we have to reduce ourselves to the outcome of a debate between the insular engineers and the professors at, you know, the architecture university, or what UNESCO thinks from, you know, their glorious offices in Paris, or the government in Rome that seems to change quite frequently, and very infrequently do any of them ever come as far as visiting Venice. The smaller and smaller Venetian population, and it's just an interesting challenge, is like, whose Venice is it?
That absolutely. Who owns Venice, and who is entitled to take the
isn't a nice word to use anymore, but yes, who can have a role in deciding what Venice we want, and how can we best here incorporate their viewpoints? I'd like to put my last slide on now. I don't know how many people would recognize that is actually Venice. That's Santa Marta, and that's a relatively busy weekend pre-coronavirus pandemic, when there were about 12 cruise ships moored in Venice, and the total number of passengers and crew on those cruise ships is more than what would have been the current population of Venice for those 2 days.
Yeah, that is telling about a lot about a future of Venice that I think you don't like to be like that. That you hope.
Actually, irrespective of what I like and what what I don't like, I know from an objective and scientific viewpoint that if something like that if a situation like that is allowed to persist, we're going to lose Venice, the very thing that the people on board those ships are supposedly coming to see. And it's something that's come out a lot in the, during the coronavirus lockdown, is, what makes Venice Venice. And we've seen the effect of the shrinking population on the city, because the lockdown left the city so terribly empty. And what we could feel so much wasn't the lack of tourists in the city, but we felt the lack of more residents in the city.
Yeah. So speaking about the future, I go up with my final slide. That is a view of Venice that is frightening, of course. Is a GDS architect for a Biennale architecture in 2010. They propose a different way to cope with sinking Venice. And so imagine Venice like an artifact surrounded by hotels and tourist industry that with their revenues they could probably sustain the city and help in its preserving. Of course, this is an extreme image, but it's not so far from what is happening with a lot of hotels around Venice in the area and in the pre-coronavirus tourist system in Venice, where it was said that in somehow Venice had any other possible future than the tourist, than be an object of cultural tourism. And when they use cultural was already a nice way to refer to tourism. So there was this idea that only being in a showcase, only being in a like a museum object, be seen from million and million of visitor, Venice can be a sustainable place in the future. And so the money that the tourism can raise in somehow can help to maintain Venice. But it's exactly linking what you were saying, which Venice we are saving. The facade of the palace is sinking in the water because no one is going to taking care of their foundation, and also on the future ideas on how to use those palaces. So there is a project for the future of Venice. That is the project not planned in Rome or in Paris or whatever, but should be a project that from bottom up rise from a certain critical mass of residents with different idea, archaeologists, environmental scientists, fishermen, or whatever.
And we, in line with that, what you just said, we shouldn't even be talking about saving Venice. Venice has its life to live as a city with its diversified population. And
yeah, I completely agree with you. And I take your idea that save Venice can become an ontology that is not only positive. I have my book recommendation, as we said. It is a book by Lynn Meskel. She's an archaeologist. She's from Australia origin, but she studied in UK, and then now she's teaching in US. And with this book that is referring how UNESCO and UNESCO idea of saving the world, it is a great thing, but has a lot of B-side that we have to look for. And for Venice, there is a very interesting chapter about Venice, is exactly that conservation sometimes becomes something political and much more economic issues that is not absolutely helping local communities.
Very interesting. And my book is available in PDF for free. It's I happened to write it, and it's called Acqua in Piazza, and it explains water levels in Venice, how they've changed over time, what determines them, and what the future can potentially bring for water levels. And more than anything, I think it apart from giving very important information for anybody who's thinking of studying Venice further, it's essential baseline information, but it also introduces people to the ambiguity of all things Venetian and how one needs to deal with needing to think about stuff. There's no ready answers for anything to do with anything about Venice. The most we can do is find out, better DNA sequencing so that people like Diego Calaon can know more about the archaeological origins of the trees that they find. But everything relating to the future of Venice, so much depends on people being able to think things through.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that is exactly the idea that it is mastering environmental humanities, it is new degree course that will start this very academic year in Venice is aiming. So making the student able to look different sources from biology to history and of course humanities, and being able to become the interpret of this dynamic system that cannot be simplified in one walking level measurement or one set of activity that is ordered to do, and this could be the solution. No, the solution is the complexity, I think.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Very much, and I hope that we go on with this conversation as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Jane.
Goodbye.
Goodbye, and goodbye to everyone.